People are still streaming pretty readily. While we're getting ready and everyone is still hopping online, what is one of the most interesting things you read from intros yesterday? Drop it in the chat. One of the things that I was shocked by is how many people had apparently visited Japan and like the culture shock from that. I thought that was really interesting. Someone in the morning session as well mentioned the crazy diversity of all the different people. You know, you've got like a high schooler who's just graduated, and then like people going to Stanford and doing cool things. I'm much closer to the high schooler that just graduated than Stanford, but maybe that's just me. I think we're good to get going though. It seems like it's calmed down. Yeah.
All right. Okay. All right. Hey everyone, welcome to day 2 of the Open Source Contributor Initiative. I am Aswin. I am a senior front-end engineer at Amazon, AWS, and I primarily work on OpenSearch dashboards and regarding the visualization side, the platform and everything. So if you're working on anything front-end, you might track with me at some point, but otherwise, let me actually put the professional side of me aside and tell you kind of why I volunteered to be a mentor on this program. So essentially what happened was when I was, so I've been contributing open source for quite a while now. I have some of my own pet projects for open source. It's always been fun. Like whenever you use some open source software, at least when I use it, I was like, hey, one day when I can code with just as good, let me also try to contribute back. So that's kind of where I got my kicker into open source. And then I think when I went into grad school, I had an opportunity where one of the professors was like, hey, I'm going to host an entire class for just open source. So that helped me actually contribute to, so until then, all my contributions were very minor. They were for repositories where there was at most 1 or 2 other maintainer and not so many developers, but that was my first opportunity to contribute something big. And that's also what made me the most nervous, because when you see a big project out there, you obviously get nervous saying, oh my God, so many people are relying on this project. So many people are going to depend on it. So you be afraid like your contributions may not seem significant compared to some of the most experienced developers out there. But what I actually learned when I actually contributed, and I contributed to WordPress, was that people are actually really nice in open source, and they really like to interact and work with the community. So even small contributions like updating documentation or making a small bug fix here, or just like calling out an issue that they've faced, that you faced, that helps them understand what the problem is all appreciated, and they're really kind of nice. So I was like, once I graduated, I was like, okay, if I ever come across another opportunity like this where I can be on the other side, where I can be a mentor for somebody else, I would love to. So when Iskander brought around the opportunity to do something like this, I was on board and I was like, let's do it. So that's kind of where my background for why I joined as a mentor for the Open Source Contributor Initiative came from. And I hope to be as good of a mentor as my mentors were when I joined the other program that I was in. So that intro aside, let's quickly go over what I plan on covering during this workshop. The main reason we're having this workshop is just because we noticed in the previous iteration of this program that many contributors were at different levels or different stages in their programming career. So it kind of helps to have baseline everyone at the same level and same expectation as to how you do some of the basic setups and basic interactions with Git and GitHub in terms of making a contribution to an open source project. Because it's not the same as when you do it for your own pet project, when you are the owner, the maintainer, and the consumer of the code all by yourself. When you start contributing to bigger projects, you're going to have to follow a slightly different workflow that has more intricacies and more processes that you might have to navigate through. So that's kind of why we are having this workshop. So at any point of this, feel free to use the chat and ask questions. And I'll try to answer as many as possible. And David and Steven are here to help me out, and Craig are here to help me out with answering those questions for you guys. So what are we going to cover today? So first, I want to make sure that all of you have the Git set up the way you kind of need to for OpenSearch contributions. I'll cover more of that later on. I also want to show you how, by the end of this workshop, make sure all of you all contribute a pull request to the project website repository. And the reason I'm making this happen is to make sure that you guys feel comfortable contributing to an actual repository that we're actively using, as opposed to some toy repository that we created just for the purpose of this workshop that doesn't have an impact on something. So the meaningfulness and the mental block that you have to overcome to like make a contribution there, I hope is going to be helpful for you guys to not feel as nervous contributing to other OpenSearch projects and repositories. So that's kind of why this workshop is focusing on that repository. At the same time, I also hope that by the end of the program, if any of y'all are interested in contributing like a blog post or something, you can actually keep the author status of your contribution in that repository at the end of the program. So I'll cover more of that once we come to the contribution itself. I also want to quickly introduce you to the kind of the Git flow we'll follow to make contributions to open source projects. And this is an opinionated flow. There are many ways of doing it. So if you have another flow that works for you, by all means. But if you don't and you're confused as to what's the best, like what's a reasonable way to do it, I can show you mine. And if it makes sense for you, please go ahead and use it. You'll also be making your first commit. And I'll walk you through how I make commits for OpenSearch and what the requirements that we look for are. Opening a pull request. Also, I hope that you guys can review each other's pull requests as well to kind of like offer suggestions. And I'll also be reviewing one of the pull requests with you guys to show you what I kind of look for when I do a pull request review from the community. And finally, there's one thing we noticed from my last iteration as well, was that because these are a big open source project, we usually have a lot of contributions happening in the main repository. So when you fork a repository, sometimes your forks often tend to go out of sync with the main repository. And people did find it difficult to kind of keep them in sync. And how do you manage that workflow? So I want to just walk you through how that workflow would look like to keep things in sync. Sorry, I feel like I need to do this every single time, but I will mute my phone. Apologies for that. Okay, so to get started, I have the entire workshop in a GitHub gist that you can actually follow for the entire workshop. I am pasting this link in the chat. Also, David, or if you can post the same thing inside the Slack channel, that would be amazing.
Got you.
All right. So before I get started, any questions so far? Okay.
Yeah, I just have a quick question. What's the difference between forking your repository and pulling a repository?
That's a good question. So for that, if you have access to the link for the gist right now, if you scroll down to this section over here where I explain the relationship between Git and GitHub, I can explain the differences between the nomenclatures that we use. And also I want you to, like, if I mention any word that you're like, oh, what does that mean? I have a list of all the common Git related words kind of described down below here. So if I say fork, branch, clone, push, there's a small definition up here. But for your specific question, we have 3 places that we usually work with our repository. So there's the upstream, which is the nomenclature we call for the original repository where everyone's referencing it all the time. Right, that's going to be owned by OpenSearch, and it's going to be like, if you want to make any changes, that's where you're going to contribute changes to and pull your changes from. Then you fork that repository. Basically, you make a copy of the repository for yourself in GitHub, and that's called the origin repository. Right, that's where you own the repository. It's your version of the same repository, and any changes you make there is owned by you. Most of the time, it's just an identical clone of upstream. It's just that you now have permissions to do whatever you want with it, as opposed to upstream where you may not have permissions. But that's essentially a fork. Pulling a repository is slightly different, where now you take a copy of your origin or of upstream, either one, and then you pull it down to your computer itself and you work with it. That's your local copy of your repository. And pull is actually an action. It's not a version of the code base. So when you pull the changes, you essentially take the changes from somewhere, some kind of remote repository, and pull it down to your computer. That's what pull does. Does that make sense? All right.
So basically, fork is where like you're just borrowing someone else's and then you're changing it, but pull is basically what you're just storing it on your own computer. Does that make sense?
They're not similar. They're not comparable to each other. Essentially, forking is essentially okay. David, do you want to take this?
I was going to say, forking just copies it into your GitHub repo in the cloud, and then pulling it actually brings it local, so you can modify it and then make changes and then send it into GitHub. Does that help?
Yeah, I think of
I
it like
see.
a
So it's
clone.
Yeah.
Like a
okay.
clone kind of. And then one's in the cloud and one's on your computer. So like you might hear local and remote. Local would be the repository you pull down on your local computer. Remote would be what you push the code to up in the cloud on GitHub.
Oh, I see. All right. That makes sense.
All right, awesome. Yeah, and again, if there's a lot you can go down if you're unfamiliar with Git, and it is a little intimidating for people of getting started with it for the first time. But thankfully, there's way too many resources online for how to learn if you want to learn and play with Git. So I'd suggest like some of the useful resources I've posted down here to just play with and get yourself familiar with Git. If you're not, it's really useful. And honestly, I wish these tools existed when I first started learning about Git, because back then I generally had to use Git's own documentation, which is, in my opinion, the worst way to learn for a beginner, but really useful once you're advanced. Okay, with that out of the way, any other questions before we start? All right. I'm also just going to keep the chat window open here so I can keep an eye on it. Yeah, someone suggested asking ChatGPT. ChatGPT is also pretty good at giving you explanations for these things. So if you're curious, do check it out and ask it questions. All right. So why do I mention setting up configuring Git specifically for OpenSearch? So all commits made to OpenSearch kind of need to have a signature stating that you have made this change. It is your original change, and you are agree to the licenses that the repository is built on. So we use the Apache 2 license, which is an open source license. So you're saying that, yeah, the code that I'm contributing will also adhere to the same license, and I agree to that. So that's kind of why you need to put a signature for it. And Git makes it really easy to add the signature, and you need to configure it first to do that. So Git has a really nice thing called git config-global user.name, and then you put your name, and you do the same for email. So once you do this, every single time you commit changes to your repository, and you add the sign-off flag, and I'll show you that as you come later on into the workshop, it automatically adds this information to every single commit. And if you make contributions to GitHub for OpenSearch, if you do not have this set up correctly, our signature checker will complain, and then the maintainers will ask you to like amend your PR to add the signature. So this is just one of the biggest configuration you'll have to do before you make any commits to OpenSearch.
One thing I'd like to add there is this should be the email that you used for signing up for GitHub as well, typically. It doesn't have to be the one that you signed up for the campaign with. So associate it with GitHub. Yeah. The second thing is, now, because some recent changes to GitHub and its authentication policies, whenever you use the git command that connects to your remote and does some sort of like connection there, it usually asks for some sort of authentication. Previously, you could use a username and password to do this for GitHub, but ever since that changed, you kind of that password option was taken away, and the only real way to do that is using SSH or my preferred option using personal access tokens. So it's pretty easy to set that up. All you got to do is go to this link that says settings.tokens and just generate a new token. And as I said, take the classic one. It's good enough. And then once you have that, you scope it, and the default permissions should be fine, good enough. And then at the end of once you create the token, you get a string that is your token. Keep it safely because that's the only time GitHub will show it to you. And then after that, depending on how long you've kept it to expire, I usually, once I want to use frequently, I just don't set any expiry date at all. And then and that is now your password whenever Git prompts you for a username and password. So use your username as your GitHub ID, and password is your authentication token. And with these two, you should be able to make any commits, pulls, and changes. And once you do this, I think Git remembers this and never really asks for you again until the token expires, in which in your case should be never. So that's the only other thing you need to worry about for Git.
What do you recommend? Sorry, just that last really quick. What do you recommend to put as the scopes for the token?
It depends. For the basic operations, you really don't need any of the extra permissions. I just leave it all off by default, unless I know exactly what extra permission I need. Most of the others are meant for API access and stuff. So if it doesn't work for you, I just say go back. I don't remember what the options for the scopes were, but it should be pretty easy to figure out. And at least for as far as the workshop is concerned, even if you leave all of them off by default and just the default ones on, it should work. All right. Okay, so let's quickly make sure that, and how do you verify this? All you gotta do is type git config into your terminal, and let me also quickly do that. In an instance I have over here. There we go. So let me just pull this editor in here. All right, so just to make sure Git works correctly, type git -- version. I have git 2.25. Any version of Git usually works. And then git config. -v. Oh, do you remember what the command was to see if the Git configuration is correct?
It's, git config. I'm pretty
No,
sure.
Yeah,
ls.
for the remotes, git remote -v.
Not the Git remotes, but I'm just trying to remember what the command was for to make sure all my Git is configured correctly.
Yeah, you could do git config user.email. I don't remember the one that shows both of them off the top of my head.
Yeah.
User.email will show you the email, or user.name will show you the name. And
Yeah,
this
so
is the currently scoped, yeah.
So if you run these two commands and you see your name and email show up correctly, you should be good. So that means you've configured Git correctly at least. All right. So what's the next step we do? Let's go to the project website. URL again should be there in the gist. And what we want to do is we want to fork this repository and make our own clone of this repository. So GitHub makes it really easy for us to do. There's a fork button right up top here. You click on that. Since I've already made a fork, I'm not getting the options to create one. I usually leave the name and everything default because it's easy to remember where the fork came from. So in my case, it's just my GitHub alias followed by the project website namespace. And once you do this, you should have a fork of the repository. Now, I'm going to quickly actually talk about syncing up right now instead of later on, just because it's right here. GitHub really makes it really easy to sync your fork with the origin repository, upstream repository, and by just giving you the sync fork button here. So right now, since I've cloned this before, and since I've forked it and last synced it, there's been 27 commits that have been added to the main repository that I don't have. So I just say update branch. And with that, my fork and the upstream repository are both in sync now. So all the changes that are there in that are also there here. So this is the easiest way I would recommend syncing your repositories. There are other ways to do it, and I'll come to that at the end of the workshop. But if you want to keep your repository in sync, this is the way I recommend. The next thing you want to do is you want to also clone this repository down into your computer so you can actually work with and edit it. So again, the easiest way to do is just like click on the code button on the top here. It'll all default HTTPS and just copy this URL. And then go to your terminal inside your computer and go into the folder, to any folder that you want to like edit. So I'll go up one and I'll say make test. Okay, and then cd into test. So there's nothing in this folder right now, and I've just made an empty folder inside my computer, inside which I'm going to clone this repository into. I'm going to assume that you guys know how to use the terminal. If you don't, let us know in the chat or the Slack, because I'm assuming all of you have had some experience writing some computer code before. You've interacted with terminal before, and these commands should be pretty uniform across all terminal applications. So to clone it, it's pretty straightforward. You just say git clone and you paste the URL, and Git automatically creates a new folder for you called the repository name. So even if you accidentally create this inside another folder which has other things inside it, you don't have to worry. All the contents of the Git of your repository will be inside a specific folder with your Git project name and co-located inside that. So also, depending on which repository you're cloning now, this is the project website. Some of the other repositories are much bigger in size, so they may take a lot longer to clone. Don't be surprised, it's okay. But yeah, project website, thankfully small enough, in a few seconds, you should be able to clone it. All right, so Again, if I do ls, I see this new project folder exists. I will go into that and I have all my files. So I'm going to just pause here for a second and make sure, has everyone followed through until now? Any questions? Okay, that's awesome. So next thing we're going to do is you can use any application of your choice to edit code. There are IDEs, there are text editors. You can also use just like command line tools like Nano and Vim and stuff. It's your choice. I'm going to use VS Code because that's my preferred editor of choice. But don't feel like you have to use the same thing. And again, it also depends on the repository you're working with. If you work in the Java repository, there's IDEs that make more sense for Java. For JavaScript, Python, there may be other ones. So feel free to use whichever makes sense. Because this is a Ruby repository and what the change you can make is just a text change, it doesn't really have to, it doesn't matter what you use, it should all work just as equally well. So because I'm using VS Code, I'll quickly use my terminal to open up this repository in a new window.
Hey,
Okay.
Ashwin, real quick. While that's loading, would you mind showing where the fork button is and that workflow one more time? A couple people missed that.
Sure thing. Yeah. Let me go back over to the original repository. So this is the OpenSearch project website repository. So if you click on the link, this is where you come to. There is, of the 4 buttons on top, you have this fork over here showing you there's 26 forks of this website, of this repository. Click on that, and then automatically it says, hey, create a new fork. And because I've already created one, I'm getting a different screen from what you will see. But you should ideally see your GitHub ID followed by a text box in which project website will be default filled in. And there should be a green button somewhere down there that says create fork. I wish I knew how to create a new one again, but I don't think it's allowed me to do that. So I'm just going to leave it as is.
You could go to another repository that you've not forked before to see the screen as well, Ashwin.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. Let me see which one I can go to. I think build, I haven't forked this yet. Let's see now. Oh yeah, there you go. Yeah, see, I just leave it as default. I don't change really anything over here. I just say create fork. So automatically that, and also I copy the main branch only checked in, just because that's the branch on which all the changes will be built on for most use cases here. I don't need this repository right now, so I'm not going to fork that. And I will go back into the project website and down to my fork. Okay, so going back over, yeah. So we forked the repository, we've cloned it. One other thing I want to make sure we do, and I recently realized Git does this by default, thankfully, but if it's not done, and it's a quick way to verify it, just type git remotes-v inside your terminal once you're inside the folder in which the project was cloned into. So right now this is over here for me. So if I say pwd, you can see I'm inside project website. And then if I say git remotes-v, I should have 2 remotes. I should have origin and I should have upstream. If you only see origin, you don't see upstream. By default, usually when you clone something from GitHub, you do get origin by default. Upstream is, as of now, I believe always set in as well. But if it's not, there's a way to add extra remotes to your repository. And the reason we do this is to make sure that you want to always make sure you are pulling the latest changes from the main repository, which everyone's contributing to, right? So if your fork is behind for some reason, you can always just pull from upstream and say, hey, give me the latest changes from upstream. I want to make sure my copy on my computer is up to date with it. It helps you with other things as well in future. Again, if you miss this step, it's not the end of the world, but it's something I like to keep set up initially when I start the project up. So if you have your remote set up perfectly, the cloning section is done, you're good to go, your Git repository is set up, and you're ready to make your first commit.
I'm going to drop one more thing on audio real quick. You have to change directories into the repository after cloning it. I just realized that's a step that's missed, and a couple people are trying to list remotes outside of the repository. So after you git clone, change directory, cd into your forked repo.
That's a good call. I actually have left as 5A. It should have actually gone above this. Good call out, David.
Yep.
yeah, make sure you make all the Git commands should run inside the folder in which all the repositories clone into. So, yeah. Then another thing I usually like to do by default, like almost automatically, is just to make sure I immediately create a new branch for any change I want to do. Just because I like to keep the main branch intact with no changes of mine introduced there. And any change I make right now to this repository will be changing the main branch, which ideally we do not want to do. So the command for that is pretty straightforward. Now, the way for those who don't know what Git branching is, branches are just Git's way of making a copy of the repository again, but a different way to copy it, where it doesn't copy all the files, but just says, hey, this is a new version of all the changes I want to make. It's different from the origin with these extra things that I'm adding into it. And it's kind of made as a disposable way to make changes without breaking something that you've already sure works. So let's say main is a working branch where everything, your code works as expected. And now you want to do something which you're not sure would make or break something, right? And because if you only had one copy of the code to work with, you'd be really scared of making changes. So branches are really easy to just like create, make some changes. If it doesn't work, throw it away. And if it works, bring it back. So by default, just always create new branch. You can always just delete them if you don't want to. And Git has 2 steps to do this. First, you create a branch and then you check out this branch and so that you're into the branch and you're working on the branch. But it also combines both of these commands into a single command that says just git check out -b. -b is the flag to say also create the branch if it doesn't exist. And I usually just say, and then you give the branch name. Now the branch name can be any name that makes sense to you. It's just an easy way to identify what your branch, what you're working on is in the branch. So I usually like to prefix it with one of 3 of my favorite prefixes. For this one, since it's just a small change, which is not really a feature or a fix, I usually call it chore / add author --PC. So this tells me like this is a chore that I'm going to do, and what it does is adds a new author to this repository called for myself. So again, you can call it anything you want, and you can see here, switch to this new branch, call this. And also you can see that my terminal also lets me know which branch I'm working on, and so does my IDE. Again, some IDEs do this, some IDEs don't, it's fine. Again, if we just say git status, it should tell you which branch you're on. So there's easy ways of like Git also makes it easy to find out which branch you're working on and what you've done. So has anyone faced any issues coming this far?
You want us just to name the branch anything you want? Doesn't really matter, or?
It doesn't really matter. It's mostly for you to identify for yourself where you are in the, like if you have multiple branches and you're wondering what changes you made to each one, looking at the branch name is an easy way to kind of identify, oh, this is what this branch does, that's what this branch does. And I just like to kind of have like a system for myself to make it really easy for me to identify these things. But if you have your own system or if you want to create a new one, feel free. There's no real implications to what the branch name is. Also, my editor also has a neat little extension to visualize this visually over here. So you can see right now, I'm on the commit and my branch is bold here. It says chore add author Aswin PC, but it's also referencing the exact same commit on main and on the origin branch that my fork is on. So everything's on the same commit. So if I run this, it's as I'm running the main code. All right. So once you've made this new branch, now we're actually going to make the change. And let me explain what the change is right now. So as part of this workshop, I want each of you to add yourself as an author to this folder inside the repository called _authors, OSCI 2023. And we have a template in here which you can copy and create a new file for yourself. Add a name, add a short name. If you have a Twitter handle, add it. If not, just remove this entire line. And please make sure to add your GitHub alias. We're going to be using this to kind of track who is part of the program and what your GitHub alias is, and also something about yourself. And the reason we're doing this is twofold, like I mentioned earlier. One is to just know who are the participants of the program, and we're trying to make a cohort page that will list all of y'all in that page. Also, at the same time, if you are interested in contributing a blog article or something about open search into a blog, all the authors for that are actually also listed over here, and you keep the status at the end of the program where you get to be an author on this website with your profile showing up. So but it's not mandatory to do that. It's just if you're interested, they can do something you can do. But at the same time, also it's a good way to contribute a change to a repository that is being used actively. So yeah, just take this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do something similar too. I'll just copy that file. I'll paste it. And then use your GitHub alias whenever there's an option to choose a name for something. It's easy to identify who did what. So I'm just going to use Aswin PC. I'm going to use my name here. And then I don't have a Twitter handle, so I'm going to take that off.
I'm disappointed. I expect better from you, Ashwin. Get Twitter or X or whatever it is now.
Well, ever since I found out you have to pay for it just existing on the website, I'm like, nope, thank you.
Yeah, no, I second that.
Anyways, I love brunch. Oops. I should keep it professional. Okay. So yeah, once I've saved this file, officially you've made a change, and as you can see, my ID is also really letting me know that I made a change with this U symbol here. So what does that mean? So Git has this structure of, so Git has 3 ways you can modify a file. You can create a new file that has never seen before. That's called an untracked file. You have a file that you already exists, but you modified it. That's called a modified file. And then finally, you can delete a file. So and it represents that by saying D. So U, M, and D are the keys by which you Git identifies the files you've added, removed, or modified. And it also has 2 stages in which you can kind of keep the track of your changes. So by default, any changes you make to a Git repository are by default untracked and just a regular change. And if you say git status again inside your oops. The terminal, you can see it tells you that, hey, you're on branch, sure. You have 1 untracked file inside authors, OSCI 2023 with my name and markdown. So this is the easy way for you to know, like, hey, am I only changing the files I care about changing? If you see files in here that you should not be, like you have not changed and actually show up, that's probably you have actually made a change to a file that you should not be making, and this is a quick way of telling that. Again, Git has so many user interfaces to make this easier for you. VS Code, for example, has this nice source control panel here, which shows me all the changes I've made. And if I click on that, it says, hey, here's what you've changed inside your file. Really useful to just know, like, hey, have I made the changes I care about? And if I've made something I don't, you should probably remove that. Now, once you do this, usually I also recommend, once you make a change that you're sure you want to keep, you also should probably stage it. So Git has another thing called staging your changes. So that's all you have to do is say git add followed by a file name, file you want to stage. But you can also say git add period, which will just add every single thing that is in your changes into a section called staged. And you can immediately see in my user interface here, my change went from the changes section to the staged section. Why would you do this? Let's say you're working on a change that, you've made something, you're like, okay, I'm pretty confident this is a good change, but I want to play around with a little more, try another approach, right? But you're not ready to commit this change into your history yet. So what you do is you just stage those changes, and now I can go back into my file, and then I can be like, I do not affirm it, and save it. Now, again, I may make many such changes. Now, I don't remember what those changes are, right? But I'm like, oh, shoot, I did something. I messed up my code. I want to go back to the last point at which I knew everything was the way I wanted it to be. So that's kind of where staged and unstaged comes into, like, it's really helpful. So if I go here, I'm like, oh, I have, and actually, if you just say again, git status, it shows you like, hey, you have a new file called this, and you also have a modified file. Because as far as Git's concerned, since the staged file exists, this new change is actually a modification of the old file. So it's not a new untracked file, it's a modification of the already tracked file. So it's like, hey, you modified something about that file. Is that what you wanted? And again, if you have a nice UI like this, it shows you what the change is, and you're like, oh, I don't want that. You can just, again, you can restore the file using this command as shown here. or you can just revert it like that. And then your state changes are all that exist. Everybody with me so far? Any questions? I see a bunch of comments in the chat.
Yeah, I think one that was good, and this could just be an opinion piece, but what do you think about committing, chunks, little bits when it's complete? How do you handle that?
Yeah, so again, the beauty of Git is that it's quite versatile in what it can do, and it's almost like any action you do is quite trivial and reversible almost. There are very few actions in Git that actually make you lose information that you have saved at some point or the other. So if you like a workflow where you don't mind having again, this is where the tree is very important. So if I show you the Git graph, you can see this tree here, right? Some people like this tree looking very pretty. Like they only want to see things inside this tree that really make sense. Some people really don't care. It's like, hey, I have a few commits here that I know I need to worry about. Everything else in between doesn't matter to me. That's another way of working it. And again, it depends. It's down to personal preference. Usually, the repository owner has the biggest say on how this tree needs to look. And when you make a change in yours, Git also provides you a way to squash them, expand them, like a lot of things you can be done. So at the end of the day, it comes down to personal preference in a lot of cases. It's very opinionated. And I don't like to make a lot of commits. The way I kind of do it is I make sure the commits that I do are all working commits, so that, hey, it's a version of the code that I like, I will not want to go back on, or I'm like, I'm satisfied with it. So if I don't like it, I usually stage it or stash it or use some of the other options Git provides. But that's personal preference. You do not have to do this. You can use literally anything else that makes sense. And if you actually Google Git flows, there are many Git flows out there and ways people use Git. So, feel free to do the one that makes sense to you. The main purpose of Git is to make sure you don't make a change that, like, you have a way of going back or reverting back to something that you like, or what the changes you made are and the history of it. That's the most important use of Git. The history of Git.
I wanted to throw in my 2 cents on this very opinionated topic. As Ashwin said, there's a lot of ways to change it. So even if you start with a lot of commits and you want to combine them and squash them, that's possible. One thing that's really useful to think about is Git is all about being able to compare changes. And so if you have parts of work that you want to compare to, like previous parts of work, because you've already opened a PR, having another commit that is easy to see the diff between those makes it really a lot easier on other people that are following along with those changes. So when you're just the only one looking at the commits, it doesn't matter as much. But when you're kind of communicating differences or changes, that's when the commit organization matters more. But again, it is very personal, and various projects do things in wildly different ways, maybe even across OpenSearch, I'm not sure.
And I'd also like to chime in. You'll see, people are opinionated on the topic, evidenced by all the engineers chiming in here. Git is really good at tracking history. And as an engineer, you might not remember code you wrote like 2 years ago and what your mindset was like at the time. Git is really good at remembering that history. And so like when David says logical chunks, that's sort of the way I go about it too. I do also use it to sort of do code checkpoints if I'm near the end of the day and there's like an open task and I just want to check in some stuff, but I might not push it. I might sort of keep it on my local and then finish working on it the next day. You do what works for you. I wouldn't suggest making them like necessarily enormous, but sort of checkpoints. I like thinking of them as sort of checkpoints. And I did see another question in the chat about where to place this file as well. And there's a subfolder under authors called OSCI 2023. Please add that to that folder there. And please do not add pictures or asset with your picture in it too. Just the socials and an introduction.
At least for now. I'd like to. I'm just kidding. I'm not going to chime in on my Git flow.
Well, thanks for starting that off, David. Yeah, that was a good question though. Like that's actually like when you come first to Git, you do get confused because everyone has their own opinion on how to do it. Don't get overwhelmed. Again, you can change this as you wish as you learn more about Git. I'm not using the same process I used when I joined and I started using Git. So again, do what works for you. All right. With that in mind, now that we know that all the changes are exactly where we need to be, let's actually commit our change and make sure this is recorded in the Git's history. That's also fairly straightforward to do. All you gotta do is say git commit -m. -m is a flag to say this is the name I want to give my commit, the message I want to give my commit, so that if I go to my tree and I look at all the changes, without actually looking into the change itself, the give commit message should usually give me a good idea of what that change contains. So if you're doing logical chunks, what does this logical chunk contain should be mentioned here. So here I am going to say adds, actually I'm going to say OSCI, adds new author.
Ashwin, I'm going to stop you before you get any farther. You forgot to sign off your commit.
Oh, I'm not done yet.
Oh, okay. Oh, look at you. All right. I always do mine at the beginning. So I'm like, oh man, is he about to forget on live? No, you're just showing me up. Okay. I'm sorry I even chimed in.
No, it's fine. But it's a good call. Like, make sure every commit that you make is signed off. If you don't, the CI will complain. Maintainers will ask you to go back and sign off on your commits. So it's a very good point that David's making. Make sure you sign off your commits. It's very easy. Just do the -s at the end or in the beginning. Just make sure it's after the git commit message, git commit command. But as long as you have that and you hit enter, it should say, hey, you've added this new commit. You've changed one file. In my case, I made 7 insertions or 7 line changes, and it's created. Again, now if I go to that tree that I talked about earlier, you can see now my commit is 1 ahead of everything in main. And if I click on that down here, you can see this is my git commit message that I said, and then you can see the sign off section down below. This is what our CI looks for to say, hey, has this person signed off, and has the email and name match what they have on GitHub? So this is really, really important. So just make sure you do this always. If you use a user interface like VS Code or some other Git's user interface, there are usually ways to automatically add sign-off message to all your commits. I forget what the command is, the setting is for VS Code, but if you Google it, it's fairly straightforward to figure it out. So that's how I set it up. So every time I make a git commit message from directly here, it adds a sign-off message. And with that, you've made your first commit. Give yourself a pat on the back. So once you make the commit, now let's push this change up into our fork of the repositories. Again, Git makes all these really easy. All you gotta do is say git push origin. Now, origin is the name of the remote, which is our fork. You don't have permissions to push these changes to the upstream repository. So if you say git push upstream, it won't work. Followed by, now this is usually enough if you're already on the branch you care about, but I also like to usually just put the branch name as well, just to be extra sure I'm only pushing the right changes. And it uploads everything to the remote. Now, this is usually where Git prompts you for the username and password. So if it had not prompted you for this before, if it never prompts for it now, remember that personal access token you created. Use your GitHub username as the username, alias as the username, and the password is your personal access token. And you should be able to authenticate and push your changes to the remote. And to verify that the changes have gone through correctly, let's go over into project website. And let me go to my fork. So here you should see you have a new branch called Sure, add author action pieces. So clearly that push went through correctly. That's good to know. Now Git, usually when you push a new change, also provides this nice user interface on top to automatically create a pull request for this into the main branch. Sometimes it doesn't show up. I don't know what causes it to not show up. So I want to show you how to do it, even if you don't see this nice handy dandy option here. What you want to do is you want to go to the repository. You want to, push your changes to, which in this case is OpenSearch project -OpenSearch project website, and go to the pull request tab. And in here, you create new pull request. And by default, it only lets you compare branches inside this repository itself. But since you're bringing it from another forked repository, you'll also have to click on this compare across forks button. So this lets you change the base repository and the head repository. So the base repository in this case, just leave it as OpenSearch project main, or in whichever project you're working on, just leave that as is. And the base branch is usually main, so don't worry about that. The head repository should point to your forked repository. So in my case, it's my alias followed by project website. And the branch is the newest one, add author action pieces. So immediately I think, hey, can I merge this change? It's like, yes, there's no problems with it. It shows me the commit that I've made, and it shows me the change that I made. And this should look exactly what you expect. If you see anything you don't expect to see here, probably something in this up here is wrong. Maybe you're trying to merge into the wrong branch, or you're trying to merge into the wrong base repository. Something over there is usually the culprit. If not, there's probably some commit you've committed that you should not have, change you've committed that you should not have. So yeah, if everything is right, you should see something very similar to what I'm seeing. And then you just click create pull request. And here, the way I like to usually create my pull request is I make sure that I have some sort of prefix in my title of the pull request to say, hey, for OSCI specifically, I'm just putting that to make sure all the pull requests that are related to this program are all clubbed together with that prefix. And then I say I'm adding a new author, and I'm also putting my alias in the title, so that when I look at all the list of pull requests, I immediately know which pull request refers to which of y'all from here. So it's really useful for us to quite quickly identify which pull request refers to whom. I also usually put a very descriptive description in my pull requests. Again, here, because all you're doing is adding a new author, it's fairly straightforward. But if you're making a bigger commit change, please write as good of a description as you can, because you have more context than the person who's reviewing FDR as to what the change contains. So anything that helps the reviewer can understand what the change is, why you're making it, what's actually being solved, if there are any screenshots, anything you can add that helps them, makes the review process easier, please add that here. This is really useful for someone who's coming into FDR to understand, hey, what am I really reviewing over here? Okay, so I'm just going to say adds new author. See, again, I don't have any issues I've linked to right now, but usually all your pull requests will have some issue you're working off of, so that you list them over here. And then since I've signed off on this message, I mark it as signed off, and I just say create pull request. And that's it. With this, you have created a successful pull request to the open source project website. And then after this, your CI will run. And again, this depends on repository to repository. They all have different continuous integration workflows. If you see, now this varies widely between repository to repository. So the best person to ask about any issues you face with this continuous integration, with any failures, any weirdnesses you see there, ask your repository mentors, whoever you want to work with. They will guide you to the best resolution for what you need to do there. Sometimes another thing I also like to do is just click on details to see like, hey, the test errors are really show up in this log over here. If I click on this, for example, it shows you like what the different steps in the workflow are. And if something goes wrong, it shows you the error log of what happened. And you reading that's really useful if you want to know like, hey, is it because of a change I made? Sometimes it's not easily readable, in which case, again, go back to your repository mentors. They'll help you out and they'll help you understand how to understand this stuff. So thankfully, project websites CI workflow is fairly simple. So it always checks for style and build. Both of them work fine. It succeeds. All right, that's a lot I've talked about. I want to make sure I've given you guys some time to ask questions. Is there anything, any issues you're facing coming this far and creating a first pull request? I see someone having an error, failed to push.
Yeah, I think on the failed to push, it said failed to push from what is it, refs. You have to make sure that you push your branch. So you create a branch locally, but that branch doesn't exist in your fork of the repo yet. So a lot of times you have to set, I said, what did I say? Set origin, set upstream. Yeah, sometimes you have to set the upstream, and then that'll allow you to push the branch up. I did that off memory. Normally Git has some hints as well as to how to resolve that.
And I don't know if it was something I said there earlier too as well, when somebody said, if I have not signed my commits and I want to amend the message to sign the commits, what can I do? And I put a message in there. There's a couple of different ways you can do that. One is one thing I wrote in the chat is a soft reset, commit those again. But if you do that and you've already pushed unsigned commits, you might need to forcibly push up the newly signed commits. Aswin, do you know if there's a way to amend a commit message to sign off commit if you previously did not?
Yes, and thankfully DCO actually gives you, and let me actually show this over here. So this is a pull request by another person. And if you go down, this is probably a DCO error. Yes, it is. So if I click on details over here, DCO really tells you like, hey, you can see down here, it says sign off is missing. Good. So you know that there's a missing sign off. It's not because of incorrect sign off. Then it also shows you right here, how do you fix it? So in this user's case, they only had one commit and that one commit didn't have a sign off. So it says, hey, just use the command git rebase head till day one, sign off. What it does is it goes back into your git history. Basically, like one commit down into history and then adds a sign off to that commit and then creates a new commit with a sign off that you can now use to make changes. And then you'll then push your changes down back into your remote branch, which is like git push. Once you push the changes, GitHub automatically knows that, oh, the branch has changed the commits that it had, and it automatically updates the pull request, and it reruns this DCO check to make sure like, hey, is this change, does this change now have the DCO? And if it does, it passes. So thankfully, the DCO checker gives you these useful commands. Usually just run them. And again, if not, Git is thankfully lenient enough that you can just always delete branches, whatever you want, and try it again. But this should usually work for most use cases of sign-off being missed. While mentioning that, I also call out one more thing is that when you make a change, you usually have reviewers suggest changes or like things that you have not done the way they expect. The easiest way to do this is to usually just make the changes inside your logo. So like, for example, in my case, let's go back to my older PR. Okay, over here. Oh yeah, here we go. So where am I? Oh, you guys committed these PRs really quickly. It's good to see. Yeah, so right now I have one commit and I'm like, oh no, I have to make another change. Let me really quickly do that. Okay, I don't know, the exclamation was too much. So I'm like, oops, I don't want that. So I say git status. Yep, I've modified a file. Git add, and then git commit and ooh, that should not have happened. Sorry, 1 second. Yeah, made a change. All right, and then I say git push. Oh yeah. Oh, this is why. Yeah, if you're upstream,
yes.
that it git again gives you useful commands. Thankfully, so say git upstream origin. And if I do that, from now onwards, any push I make does this again. This is a really useful part of Git UIs like VS Code. If I just click the publish branch, it would have done this automatically for me, where it pushed my changes, set the upstream correctly, and every change after that would have gone. So if you have a nice Git UI that you like, use it. It's much easier. But it's also once in a while nice to know these commands by heart, so that if you don't have that, you're not handicapped. All right. So with that, I've added a new change. And now if I go back to my pull request, you can see now I have it automatically. GitHub without anything from my side has updated itself to know that, hey, you've had a new change that's called made a change. That also has a sign off. And then the file now has the period instead of the exclamation mark. So if any of the maintainers ask you for any changes in your pull request, it's very easy. Just make the change, push the new changes, and you should be good to go. Archana is asking what's the S signify. That's the Git flag for signing off your incoming. The message I showed you earlier over here that adds this handy dandy signed off by followed by your name and your email. That message comes from the -S. Yep, sign off.
Hey, hi, sorry. It's not signify, it's autocorrect. I was writing like a sign off. Like after the commit message, you have put the -L, -S-S. That like that's a new for me. And is because of that, it is the sign of part is taking care of.
Yes, exactly.
And
Yeah,
and for that, we have to set up something internally that you are suggesting to go Google and set up that sign up, or just by adding my that -F and it will be take care of it.
So initially, if you remembered, I had mentioned in the beginning, you have to configure your Git by adding this username and email. If you do this, Git already knows your username and email. So every time you add the -s, it takes this value and adds it to your message. If you have not done this, when you add the -s, it'll throw an error saying, hey, I don't know what your name or email is. Can you please add that? So that's why initially I asked you to set this up. So
Got
that
it.
it's a once set and forget kind of thing.
Yeah, thank you. Thank
Yeah,
you.
could you go over creating the pull request again? I'm not sure quite like how to do it. I'm not able to find my brand.
Sure thing. All right. So first, let's go to the OpenSearch project website. And in there, click on the pull request tab. This is where all the pull requests exist. And there should be a nice green button on the top right that says create new pull request. You click on that. By default, it doesn't show you the option to take your branches in your fork. So you have to click on this compare forks link up top here. Just to make sure, my mouse is visible on the screen share, right?
Yep.
Okay, yeah, all right. So compare across forks, click on that. And I should give you 2 more drop boxes to kind of like click between. So leave the base as is because the base should be OpenSearch project website. In the head, change it to your fork of your repository. So it should be your git alias / project website. And if you do that, now inside compare the branches, your branch should show up over here. Were you able to find your branch now?
Sorry, you're cutting out on my end like for like past 10 seconds. So click on compare cross forks. And when you click on the compare, should be able to find it, right?
Then you have to change the head repository to your fork.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Only then can you know which branches you have so different from the other forks.
And then for that one, would it just be main or like just the branch that the branch that's editing
The
it?
branch that you created, yeah. You want to pull it like because both your mains are going to be in sync, so there's actually nothing to compare between the two. But the branch you created will have the changes you care about.
All right, then once I'm in here, where were you typing like you're saying like to have like a detailed description? Is that here or is that somewhere else?
So once you do this, you should have a create new pull request button because I already have a new pull request. It's asking me to view it. But if you didn't, you should see a green button that says create new. And when you click on that is when you actually go to the next page where you have the option to add a description, the title to your pull request, and anything else that's asked over there.
Oh, I see. All right. And then basically when you just put in there like just try to be descriptive also for like later times.
Yeah. So if you ever come back to it, or most often the maintainers or anyone who's reviewing a PR comes to it, that's what they will first look at. And if that should be easy, like they will look at and understand what the change you're trying to make is, and then they will go. And actually, that's a good segue to like what I wanted to show you, which is how I review a pull request. So if I just go into the pull request tab here, for example, and I want to review, let's say this one. All right. So the first thing I'll do is once I go in there, I read the description and say, okay, what is this change that I'm making? So it says adding a new author to the markdown file. I'm like, okay, that's useful, but it'd be more useful if I knew where I'm adding the author and why I'm adding it and what the author name is. Again, for this kind of small commits, not very necessary, but the bigger it becomes, it's very useful to know what the change is trying to do. And then I usually click on the files changed and I try to understand what the change is doing. Right now, I'm seeing a lot more changes than I should be seeing, which gives me the indicator that this is probably not set up correctly. And I can immediately tell why, because this author has not set the, like they're trying to merge their main branch into the OpenSearch project main branch, which when it should have been just their forked, their forked branches, forked repositories, new branch they created. So something's gone wrong over here. And again, we can discuss about this in the GitHub issue. Usually I leave a comment saying, hey, this is the issue. Can you please look into what happened here and let me know and we can help you out. But assuming that this is not the case, and I can go to another one, but just for sake of time, I try to understand every single line of code that's been written here. Usually it's code. So I'll be like, hey, does this make sense? Do I understand what's happening? If I were to write, would I write it this way? And I try to be as nice as possible and suggest changes. If I see something good, I applaud that, saying that's a really good change that you made. And in general, just try to make sure that the change makes sense to go into the repository that it's trying to go into. And if it does, if it needs any changes or any comments, I add them in line. You can do it across a single line. You can do it across multiple lines. Going to suggest a lot of changes here. And finally, you can also just, leave a comment for the entire pull request as a whole or approve it. I would not suggest adding request changes right now, just because that's, again, in most cases, once you become maintainers, when you probably want to use that, maybe sparingly use it. But usually commenting or approving, depending on what makes sense, is the way to go. And you can leave a nice comment in here suggesting what you've looked at, why you think it's good or bad, and what changes you think the author should make to this pull request. And that's usually how I go about my pull request process. Again, each of the maintainers have their own or nuances to how they do it. But in general, we just try to make sure the change makes sense to the repository it's going to, and it's really beneficial to the community as a whole.
Hey, Ashwin, can I steal the screen for a half second?
Sure thing. Go for it.
All right. Yeah, I keep getting a question over and over, and I'm going to squish it real quick. Hold on if I can remember which screen I'm trying to get to. Here we go. I think it's this one. Huzzah. Let me know when you guys can see my browser.
I can see it.
All right, cool. So I've seen a lot of questions asking about the tasks, what they are, what needs to happen. So I'm going to show you real quick how you can review your own commits and understand what those are and why we have them. So here we have, commits are signed off by DCO. This is just a check that you can, self-check yourself when you have that happen. But if you scroll down to the bottom here, we have some additional tasks. So these are part of our continuous integration workflow, or CI. And basically, these are some things that happen automatically every time a pull request happens. So first, we can see that this one, not to call out this person, has a DCO issue. So if you see this little X next to your commits, you know you need to fix your DCO. And you go again to details, just like Ashwin had showed earlier. And then there are some steps here to help you fix those sign-offs. The first is to rebase locally, and this just appends the sign-offs to the last 2 commits, or however many this says. And then push, we want to force our push because we want to overwrite the ones that we had done previously. As for the other ones, I'm going to go ahead and approve and run. So we don't automatically, we don't automatically run some checks on new first-time committers. And the reason is you can actually commit a workflow into GitHub. That workflow can go spin up a Bitcoin miner and then perpetually mine Bitcoins. So that's terrible. So as a result, we gate some of these for new committers, and a maintainer is going to have to go and click approve and run. When this happens, though, we'll get a security check that'll make sure it's not going to go and mine Bitcoins. We do some style checking because this is our project website, so we want to make sure things are spelled right. On other repos, these will be test suites. There'll be integration tests, unit tests that'll run, build tests, etc. And then here for the website as well, we have a build test. So that's what those are. That's why they're there. Don't worry too much. It's funny. I got all the way down to 40 pull requests, and then all of you submitted your requests, and I'm so happy for that. And I'm going to spend the next couple hours reviewing them, or maybe into tomorrow morning. But that is what those are. Wow, and a lot of messages came in the meantime.
Yeah, thank you, David.
Yeah, all commits need to be signed off, by the way, every single one, and that's why you'll see a lot of errors there.
Yeah, and just to add to that, open source projects tend to be very high velocity, and so those checks are to continuously integrate the changes to make sure that the changes are not introducing any new failures or regressions to intended behavior. And anytime you write new code, you want to test the code to test that it's behaving the way that you intend it to behave. And so a lot of those checks are continuously integrating to make sure that all of the existing tests pass.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I'm gonna call out one more thing while we're here. Well, I've got a captive audience. I just saw a couple people ask when the videos will be posted, where those will be posted. So definitely keep an eye on Slack. I'm gonna switch my screen share real quick. Huzzah, somewhere here Slack is. I have a much less clean workspace than Aswin. Let's see. No, just kidding. I don't see Slack anywhere. Where'd it go?
Did it get minimized?
No. Oh, there it is. I didn't recognize it because it was dark theme. That's so funny. So you'll be able to find the videos here. Also in Slack, we've just added, there's this little thing at the top right corner. Huzzah! This will show you the progress for each of the days. I posted the video for day 1 just today. Day 2's video will probably be available tomorrow, and likewise day 3's maybe Saturday. Hopefully I can get it done by Friday night. But this is where you can find the videos and things along those lines. Also, please don't check off these items. It does check them off for everybody. But these are the checklists, the items that you can expect to see from each day. And starting tomorrow, we are going to go into OpenSearch, how to clone it, build it, and OpenSearch dashboards, how to clone and build as well. And with that, I hand back to Aswin. Thank you for letting me steal the thunder.
No worries, you're good there. And thanks for actually calling those things out. That's all really good information. Okay, I just have like one more thing I want to quickly go over with you guys before I end this. And I'm sorry this went a few minutes over 1 hour time. But I want to make sure each of you all have all the information you need to make this changes correctly. All right, so if you made all the pull requests so far correctly, amazing. Give yourself a pat on the back. You made an actual pull request that most likely, if for no other reason other than changes that need to be made, will be merged into the project website. And then you are now an author as far as project website is concerned. And once you've done that, I highly encourage you folks to review other people's PRs, not just these PRs, but also in general other bigger PRs, because it's very useful to like kind of learn how people write code, and there's a lot to learn from how other people write code. It's generally the easiest way to learn how to become a better programmer. So once you're done reviewing and offering suggestions, the last thing I want to cover is just keeping the fork in sync. Like I mentioned earlier in the workshop, there's a nice clean button that GitHub offers to do this, but that's not the only way to do it. And GitHub also has nice handy dandy website that pays a tool, tells you how to sync your fork in multiple different ways. So you have the UI, like I mentioned earlier. You also have GitHub CLI, which is GitHub's own CLI tool to kind of help you manage GitHub and your repo easily. Authentication, syncing, pulling, pushing changes, even pulling down pull requests locally to make sure the pull request working correctly. All GitHub offers really good CLI tools to do that. So I highly recommend installing it and using it if you want to, but it's not required, but it's really useful when you do need it. But in the worst case in which you like, I don't want to install GitHub or GitHub CLI and I want to just do it manually, I have instructions on how you can do it using just Git itself. But again, like I mentioned, this is only if you don't want to use that, but I highly do recommend using the other options to sync your fork. And the last thing I wanted to cover was just my Git workflow. The reason I mentioned this separately from everything I've done so far is that the setup process is usually a one-time affair. So if you're working on a repository, usually you set the entire cloning, forking, syncing, all of that is done only once. But then every single time you make a new change, you're going to have a slightly different workflow from what you've done before. So this is what this is my personal workflow for doing it, and this is also changed over time, and it's probably going to change again soon. But this works for me, and hopefully it works for you as well. But if something else works for you, please feel free to use it. So what is my workflow? Real quick, it's just I first make sure I sync my fork with the upstream, just to make sure I'm on the same commits as the upstream is. The next thing I do is I pull the latest version of that down to my main. Again, a Git pull does it, and if your tool offers a nice handy dandy way to pull it down, in my case, it's just moving over to the main branch and just clicking on this nice sync button, and it pulls down the latest changes from main for me. The next thing I do is I immediately just create a new branch because I don't want any changes I make to be accidentally cause anything in main to get changed. So create a new branch and then make my changes and stage them and play around with the code until I'm happy with it. Once I am, and I verify that if the changes are what I want it to be, using the ways I showed you before, I commit them, sign them off, and push my changes up into my fork. Finally, I raise a PR like I showed you earlier from my fork into the upstream's main branch. Usually the main branch, again, for 99% use cases, it's the main branch. Add nice screenshots, use useful description, and then, yeah, That's it. So this is the workflow I follow for almost every change I make, and this works for me. Hopefully it works for you guys too, but you're not, this is an opinion of workflow again. If you have another one, another way to do it, please feel free to do so. And please do share it with the others as well. Like if there's a better way than this to do it, we'd like to know. And with that, I will leave the floor for questions. Any questions so far about anything I mentioned or anything about how to make changes or commits to open source?
Could you like, sorry, it's kind of a stupid question, but could you like once again go over like what exactly a pull request actually is? I was kind of confused about that.
A pull request, what again?
Can you just like go over again like what a pull request is? I was kind of confused when you're going over it, just like what it is.
Yeah, so pull request is essentially GitHub's way of, so when you have an upstream repository, like when you own the repository yourself, you can make any changes you want to the code, right? But when you're going to contribute changes from what you made to somebody else's code, you kind of want to have a process by which you can vet the code. Like the owner of the code can be like, hey, I want to make sure the changes coming into my version of the code make sense and are good for the repository in general. So GitHub essentially introduced a process called pull requests. It's a very GitHub specific thing. So in GitHub, you have this page called pull requests, inside which you're requesting the owner repository, in which case, in this case, it's called upstream, to say, hey, here's some changes I think you would like to use in your repository. So you're requesting them to pull these changes into the repository. And then they look at your change and go like, oh yeah, this makes sense. And if they do like it, they pull your requested change into their repository. So that's why it's called pull request. Again, that's an assumption. I don't really know. That's why they call it pull request. Different tools call it by different names. Internally in Amazon, we actually don't call it pull request. We have a slightly different name for it. But essentially the same thing. When you have a change in your version of the code, which you want to introduce into another version of the code, and it's owned by somebody else, you kind of want to request them to say, hey, here's some change I think you might like. Do you think it's good for you? And you can have a conversation there, and that's called a pull request.
And so like for the pull request, is it just like a different do you just like add your own branch to it, or does it override someone else's code?
There's only one, like again, when you're pulling a request, you're creating a pull request from one version of your code in another version of another person's code. So it's usually for one branch to another branch. It can be in the same repository, but it can also be across two different repositories. But it does override that version of the code in the new repository once it merged in.
Okay, I see.
Yeah, and it's kind of hard because Git feels like magic sometimes. Like it knows what was there before and what you're trying to bring in, and it can tell you like, hey, these two files are different and this is what's different. So there are what's called merge conflicts occasionally where maybe I'm working on something and Aswin's working on the exact same thing, and we change the name of a function. Maybe I change it to one thing and he changes it to another thing. There is a smart way that Git says, hey, look, you both did this at the same time. One of these is right, one of these is wrong, and it gives you a mechanism to resolve those conflicts. But we probably won't be coming across that too much with what we're working on, because hopefully we're all working on like new functionality kind of in our own little modular section. So
yeah, and I like to think of it as like collectively writing a novel. And we almost like, the main branch is sort of the main storyline. But if you want an alternative like sort of storyline, you might branch off and start experimenting around. And if you think it's really good and want to contribute it back, that's what a pull request is. But it gets reviewed by the community where they get a chance to request any changes. And if all is good to go, set to approve and merge it into the main history of the repository.
Yeah. And one more thing I want to add to this is like, again, for someone coming to Git for the first time, it can be a little overwhelming. I have definitely been there before. So that's why I have the links down below here. Take your own time, understand Git. It's really useful it's a really good superpower to have, and really, really necessary in software development. Almost any project you work on will use some version of version control, usually Git. And just go through the links here, play with the basics. Some of them are interactive, and you get to like actually make commits and different things, and it'll walk you through what each of them need. So if you're confused by a lot of the terms here, you probably should take some time to like read through these links. And again, reach out to us if you have any other questions or concerns about like how to use Git and stuff. But it is intimidating. I do acknowledge that. All right. Any other questions? Sorry, I'm not looking at the chat, by the way. I will pull that up.
Oh, good. I'm keeping an eye.
Henry asked, what IDE am I using to view file sets? I'm using Visual Studio Code. It's the hot thing right now. It might not be tomorrow, but yeah, especially if you're doing front-end development, it's usually one of the 2 or 3 main editors people choose to use.
Are you also using OMyZSH for your terminal?
Yes, I am.
That's also a very common one. I have the exact same theme pretty much. But it's really nice because it shows, you know, what branch you're on at this moment in time, which can also be hard to track.
Yeah, there are a lot of customizations you can do to your workflow, and all of this didn't come overnight. It's over like many iterations, many things I ran into, and went like, okay, I wish I could make it slightly better. And all of these tools are also open source, which is the beauty again. Like OMyZSH is a tool, like as David mentioned, that someone out there was like, yeah, it's hard to know which branch I'm on. So they created something that helps do something like this. And now everyone in the community can benefit from it. Quickly go through.
Greg dropping links.
Sorry. I was just gonna say that's a good call, David. Maybe it's personal. It's a personal preference. Similar to like in tomorrow's session, one of the repositories we're going to be setting up as a Java repository. There are different IDEs out there. You may use Eclipse in school. A very popular one is IntelliJ. Some of these are really up to developer preferences. You know, Visual Studio Code is a very popular IDE for front-end web development.
That's OMyZSH. That is Craig put the link up in a couple messages above for what the terminal thing that shows the branch name.
You can always type in git status or git branch to see which branch you're currently on. You may, if you're not actively looking at it, may not remember which branch you're currently navigated to.
It happens a lot. Also, Visual Studio Code is best. Mic drop. See you all tomorrow.
Wait, sorry, I have one more question.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry if I'm asking too many questions.
No, please go for it.
How is I see like step A says choose a PR to review. However, it's not. How do I like exactly approve PR? Like, what does it mean by that?
So again, because you're not a maintainer for these repositories, your approval doesn't actually, like, it's useful, but it may not actually help you merge the page change itself. But the difference between commenting and approving is that commenting is usually when you've read through the code, you make everything you understand, and you go like, hey, here's some suggestions I would like to suggest to this pull request, and you leave that as a comment. But if everything in the code change looks good to you, and you're like, oh, if I was the owner of this repository, I would definitely accept this change, you approve it then. You're saying, hey, I sign off with my name that this is a good change and this needs to go in. If you're a maintainer, that approval also lets you, like, we have approval criteria saying we need at least 2 maintainers to approve this. So if you are a maintainer, that approval actually lets you also merge those changes in. But if you're not, it's still not invalid. It's still useful for us to know, like, someone's looked at this and they think it's a good change that we should pull in.
So like, how exactly would I like leave like a comment on the PR?
Good question. So if I go over to any one of the pull requests over here, right? So this is closed, but if I take one that's open, let's go to Noah's over here, and then I say files changed. So if I want to leave a comment on a line, it's a nice plus icon that shows up. I click on that. Now any comment I add here, and I say add a single comment to start a review, adds a comment to that line. So if the owner of the PR comes back and sees this change, he's like, oh, that's what I like. Whatever comment you left is for that line that I've added. In big PRs, it's really useful to know what exactly you're talking about instead of just, hey, in general, something about this PR is wrong. And then finally, if you click up top here and you're reviewing the whole PR as a whole, you can leave a comment saying, hey, this entire change look nice or something's wrong here. Do you mind making this like changes that may make it more useful for the community? And you can either leave us a comment or approve it.
I see. Okay. And sorry, just one last question. I'm done.
Mhm.
If we're already submitting a PR, would that when it says like keeping the fork in sync, is that just for your own like repository that you made? Just because I thought that already was resolved when you committed.
So syncing your fork again, this is like when you come to understand Git better, like this is where the tree becomes really useful. And let me quickly just jump back over into the tree. So let's see now. Okay, so you can see here, I have this thing, this is upstream main. So this is the original code in OpenSearch project that is referencing this commit over here. But if I go scroll down, I can see my version, the origin references this commit. So you can see origin and upstream are referencing two different versions of the commit, which means they're out of sync. Right now, I want to pull origin back in sync with upstream. How do I do that? And to do that is where I go into my fork. Go back there. Project website. Fork. And then now if I click on sync and update the branch, and I go back in here and I fetch all the changes again, I can see the origin main and the upstream main are both referenced in the same commit. So now my version of the code and the version of the code that OpenSearch project is looking at are both in sync. That's what syncing them means. So now, because I'll always be making a branch off of my version of the commit, right? So if I'm making a branch from an older version somewhere down here, but the original repository, which is in OpenSearch project, is somewhere else, any change you make is out of sync with what you like. You're not actually referencing the latest changes that are already there in the upstream. So you sync them to make sure you're both referencing the same version of the code, and then you start making changes from there.
Oh, I see. So basically when you commit, it's just to your own local repo. And to like to actually like change the fork, you know, the online thing, the upstream, you you just keep the fork in sync.
Exactly.
And then when you do the pull request, is that's from the commit from the clone, right? Not from the fork.
Yes. So you raise a pull request from your fork to the upstream.
Oh, I see. Okay. Thank you.
No worries. Yeah, especially if you're coming new to Git, all these terms can be confusing, so don't worry about it. After you make a few commits and a few changes, this becomes second nature to you, but first time it is integrated. So I highly recommend just making these commits, making mistakes, and learning along the way.
I see.
I have a quick question.
Mhm.
So I submitted a pull request and then I got some comments on it. And then I went through and addressed the comments. So is the workflow for fixing that, all I have to do is make a new commit?
Yes, just make a new commit and push your new commit changes back into like the remote, the origin.
Okay.
And
So-
GitHub is not automatically realize you've changed something and it updates the pull request.
Oh, okay. So there's no manual change to the pull request that I have to make?
No, you don't. As long as it's up to the same branch in your remote, because it only knows about your remotes. It doesn't know anything about your local computer. So you have to push it from your computer up into GitHub, into your fork. And once you do that, GitHub automatically takes care of the rest.
Got it. Thank you so much.
That's actually a pretty common question that people have asked. So it's a good thing you asked again.
And this is actually a really good point for why we use branches, because you could be doing like 2 separate work streams. If you are on the same branch for both of those work streams and you commit them, they will both make it into the same pull request. So a lot of times it's nice, like if you're doing one thing on one branch, branches are how pull requests get logically separated. And that way your changes don't accidentally make it in, even if you're only halfway done, as I have done several times.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense then.
All right, I will just do a time check. I know we are almost 30 minutes over time, but I'm still free to answer any questions you guys want. But if you want to drop, feel free to do so. But ask any other questions you want.
Actually, I think I want to just bring up the latest comment in the chat there. Using Git for 2 years and not know words like sign off and upstream. And upstream is a very common word you're going to hear in open source software. You know, when you're working on closed source, you might work on the same like origin, same repository. You might not fork it, but in open source, you do create that fork. And so you need to keep your fork synchronized with the upstream, the source of truth, where everything ultimately gets merged into.
Yeah, actually, that was a really funny thing coming into AWS. Like, I had worked at places that didn't use version control at all. They tracked all their changes in a Word document. That was terrible. I used a place that did Git, but everyone just pushed to main, and that's just how we did things. This is the first place that I'm using branches, forks, etc. on a regular basis. So every workshop is different, every company is different. So you might be the most advanced user in your company, and that is super exciting. You, the contributors, that is. Go modernize them. Modernize your companies from here. After you learn it here, and then you go modernize the world. Thank you.
I see Nishant's comment there saying upstream is automated setup. Yeah, that's actually one of the things that I also, this is why I recommend that once in a while try using the Git CLI, because these UI tools usually do a lot of things for you by default. It's usually when you have to do something very obscure or very specific to your use case that the UIs don't do it really well. And that's when knowing those commands becomes really useful. So for example, this nice syncing, merging features that VS Code gives you today didn't really exist when I first jumped into VS Code. It did give you the basics, but wasn't as powerful as it is today. So there were certain instances when I had to do some sort of rebasing or some work tree stuff. In fact, even work tree is something that's still not supported. I'm not going to go into that right now. It's a rabbit hole, but that's a really powerful tool that Git provides that not many people know of, and is really useful if you want to work on 2 clones of your project and on your computer, which are not branches. Like, it's a different level of cloning that makes sense for very certain use cases. All right. It's 7:30. If anybody has any other questions, do you want to move this to the chat, David, or do you want to keep this open for a while longer?
No, let's I've saved the chat off. We can move this to Slack, and thank you all for coming, and I will see you all tomorrow at my session where Craig is going to tell me how to do things.
All right, awesome.
David's an expert. I know you're gonna not need any help.
Not a chance. All right, thanks all.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
All right, have a good night or good day, wherever you are in the world.